right, welcome to Park and Books cooking demonstration and interview with Matushka Melissa Naasko. And we're so glad to have you with us today, especially now that we're getting into kind of the fall winter season, cooking healthy and healing recipes. I'm sure is at the top of many lists this winter. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you. So tell us just a little bit about yourself and the new book that you've written, Hospitality for Healing.
Oh, I'm really excited to be here. For those people who don't know me, I'm married to a real core priest, and we're attached to a mission in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. It's kind of an interesting mission because it's actually located in the same space as a monastery. So the mission began first. The property was given over to the Archdiocese to start a monastery. Currently, we have one monk living here, but there are other members of the Brotherhood who are serving at parishes elsewhere. So we kind of have this interesting bifurcated, but still very unified community where we have mission parishioners, and then we have monastics, and hopefully it will grow. But that shapes a lot of what I do because like we were talking about not too long ago, I have mission meals, I have metropolitans and bishops coming to visit. I have all these kinds of things that I have to coordinate, and it gives me lots of opportunity to practice Christian hospitality. And our mission also runs a food bank, which is really important in a place like this with seasonal work. It's very rural, it's very isolated. I always tell people that you wouldn't believe it, but we're literally 109 miles from a Starbucks. And I don't know where else you can go in the country, down here in the lower 48, you can be 100 miles from a Starbucks, but we've managed it. And so it's a really good life. We live up here and it's good. I'm also fortunate to live on my husband's family farm. And this family farm was started by his great-grandfather when he moved from Finland. And for a while they were bringing Finnish wives. I've kind of ruined that. But we live here in a house that actually was built by his great-grandfather and his grandfather. So it's an L-shaped house. One wing of the house was built by his great-grandfather. The other one was built by the grandfather. And we have 11 kids and sheep and cows and ducks and pigs. And it's a wonderful, wonderful life up here in the UP.
Excellent. Thank you for that introduction. Let's go ahead and jump in and talk a little bit about the theme of your book. So how has your own hospitality developed and how do you cultivate it? So you kind of mentioned the different people that you serve, kind of in your position as mother and priest wife. So how do you cultivate that hospitality?
Well, I think hospitality is kind of a complex thing. And I think we forget that hospitality isn't just being a really good weekend hostess, but hospitality is being open and welcoming to the people God puts in your lives. Hospice is the Latin, and it means literally guests. So we get hospitality and hospital and hospice all from this one root word. And if we remember that all the people we serve are people God has put into our life, they're guests in our life for however long God leaves them there, then we can remember that when we serve them, we're serving God better. And I think that it's easier to remember these things when I'm at church. When I'm at church and I'm feeding mission parishioners after, say, Vespers and before catechism on Wednesday night, or after liturgy on Sunday, or after special events. I mean, those things are really obvious. We know that. You can look and say, I'm serving the church. I'm serving Jesus because I'm giving dinner to the bishop. I'm giving, rest and drink to the weary people who come to visit the monastery. But that's not the only way in which we can provide hospitality to other people. And it's really easy to remember at church, but it's hard to remember at home. And I think that one of the nice things about this book is the idea that we can be hospitable to the people we live with. It's not always easy. Sometimes it's harder because we bump up against each other and our rough edges collide, but we can be hospitable to those people. Not only that, but one of my goals with this book was to help people who are dealing with not only crises, medical crises in their family, great or small crises, but also within their community. How many times have we thought about the needs that someone we know might have? We always bring, say, meals to people who have babies. We bring meals to people who are sick. We bring meals to people who have experienced a death in their family, but sometimes their needs are more complex and we don't necessarily know what to bring them. I was thinking about this recently. My daughter had her tonsils out. She had her tonsils and her adenoids removed. And in the early teens, it's really late to have it done. There are a couple of reasons why we had to delay. One of the reasons was COVID. And so it ended up getting delayed almost 2 years, but it got done. But I was thinking about that when I was young, my grandparents had this kind of knowledge of the sick room in the house. They knew how to take care of people. And if you told them, oh, she's got this issue or she's got that issue, they instinctively knew what that meant. And we don't really know that anymore. For instance, one of the things that people always tell you when someone has their tonsils out is, oh, you should feed them a lot of ice cream. And actually that's terrible, terrible advice. Ice cream, actually, because the high in the back of the throat. So one of the things the doctors tell you not to do. But I had some ice cream and my daughter asked if she could have some. We gave it to her. And she said within like a couple of bites of the first time she had yogurt or she had ice cream, that it was actually really true, that she really could feel that it made it harder to kind of clear her throat, which she wasn't supposed to do, but and I realized that, our generation, I think we have absolutely no idea how to take care of sick people. We really just don't. We don't have that knowledge. And that's something that we can kind of look back on and get. But it's an intentional thing. It's not going to happen just by kind of hoping that we figure it out, especially if you go to the hospitals, because they'll give you a list of things like, don't eat this. Oh, okay, that's a start. But then how do you figure out what you should eat? So my goal for this book is not to be just sort of an esoteric, scholarly look at what people used to eat in the past and how they tried to feed their bodies for healing, but rather to make it really practical. Okay, what is this lost knowledge that we have, and how can we turn it into something that's actually useful and productive and can help us be better servants of our church and of our families and the people God puts in our lives.
Excellent. Well, as a historian, I definitely appreciate the history side of this book. And it's interesting to me that you are cultivating your grandparents' knowledge and the knowledge from, I think you listed monasteries and convents from the past and convalescent homes. And so these spaces that kind of are no longer sharing this information kind of with the greater society. So I think that this book is going to be a welcome to many kitchens as we are all caring for the sick, whether it's our children or our parents or grandparents or our friends at church. How do you see God's love in cooking?
Well, I think it's really easy. There's so many biblical examples of it. One of the things that I always find myself thinking about regularly is that when Christ turned and said, feed my sheep. Well, we're sheep. That's all of us. Anytime we're feeding somebody, we're doing that. Or think about the times when God has reminded us in the scriptures that we need to give food to the hungry and drink to the thirsty and shelter to the naked. And these are all really important ways in which we can do this. And we serve God well when we serve his creation well. And God loves us so much that he takes pleasure and satisfaction in us doing that for other people. And I think that's a really helpful way to look at it. I mean, I know that when my kids have been sick, and I think any parent understands that, and you get up like 6 times a night with a kid who's throwing up or coughing or something like that, and you're just miserable, we can lose track easily of why we're doing it. Because it's like, I love you, but I love you better at 9 o'clock in the morning with a cup of coffee and a full night's rest. But if we remember that every time we get up, if we're not feeling the joy, and we aren't always feeling the joy, we can look at that child and say, Jesus, I do this for love of you. Because sometimes doing it for Jesus is a little bit easier than doing it for the kid who's already thrown up twice in his bed that night.
Yeah, excellent. What do you hope this book will bring to your readers?
Well, there's a couple of things. Like I said, I wanted to make it very practical. I wanted to make it something that people can pick up and actually follow through on. Because it's one thing to really just look at a say a 19th century cookbook, of which I have a lot. I am definitely a cookbook nerd. I have a lot of old cookbooks, but having those cookbooks doesn't necessarily mean that those things translate well into modern life. Sometimes ingredients are hard to come by. Sometimes the cooking methods are really unusual. Sometimes it's just the measurements aren't consistent, and that's a problem. And I realized that I have the benefit of being able to sort of live in a different space. So for instance, I'm going to turn you for a second. So I have my kitchen and I have things like an Instant Pot, and I have a gas stove and an oven, but I also have,
Oh, wow.
covered shoes and everything. I have this wood stove, and this occupies a big part of the kitchen. It's a source of emergency heat, but also we cook on it because this time of year, we don't usually want to try to heat the house with the outside burner. We want to just kind of just gently ease into winter without having to spend a lot of energy or time. So we actually use this regularly. I cook on this. I cook in it. It's a great oven. And so I've been able to sort of adapt a lot of 18th and 19th century and early 20th century recipes over the last 8 years that I've lived here, by really considering what does it look like when I'm cooking on wood, and what does it look like when I'm cooking at the stove. And then I actually have a summer kitchen outside where actually I have a 4-foot fire ring, and I have a tripod to hang a pot from. And actually I have spiders and things like that, because again, I'm totally a food geek. So I've actually cooked on a spider over an open fire outside, and I can adapt those things inside because I have a lot more resources for things like that than a lot of people have.
Sure, you have all of the tools that you need to help the rest of us who may just have a kitchen indoors, which my house is being remodeled right now. So I'm
So you know all
kitchen.
about cooking.
So I've been using the Instapot very often. In fact, I've figured out all kinds of settings that I didn't even understand on it before. And I have a mixer, and now our oven is plugged back in, so I have access to that. And so I think for you to include these recipes by adapting them, not only to show the historical ingredients and ways of cooking, but also to give those of us who might have just a modern kitchen a way to cook these both historic and healthy healing recipes.
One of my goals in this book is also to make sure that there are lots of methods. You and I were talking about broth not too long ago. And in my book, I talk about how to do it on a stove. I talk about how to do it in a crock pot. I talk about how to do it in an Instant Pot, because the resources that people have available to them at different times are different. And making sure that people have access to all these things and understand how the cooking methods change using these different appliances, I think is really important. And so in any way that I can give people multiple options for making something, I really tried to include it because I wanted people to have those options, because you don't really know what people need. So if I cover all the bases, then people can find what they need.
Excellent. I love that. More options is good. What recipe will you be sharing with us today, and why?
Well, so I'm going to talk about a couple of things. One of the most important things to me in writing this book was talking about broth. Broth is basically the universal foundation of a convalescent diet. It doesn't matter what's going on in your life, broth is a really good option. There are some people who actually are on liquid reduced diets, so they can't have a lot of broth. You know, kidney disease is a difficult thing to manage. But by replacing water in foods like pasta or rice with broth, that means that we can actually bump up their nutrition, particularly their protein levels, without giving them too much raw protein. So because it's this sort of universal ibuprofen, give it to everybody thing, it's the very first thing I cover in my book. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit. And I'm going to talk about using the Instant Pot. I have my Instant Pot out, but there were a couple things that I wanted to go ahead and add that people might not realize. So one of the questions that I get asked really regularly by people who are interested in learning how to make bone broth is, why does beef broth taste so bad when they start with fresh bones. And it's like, it's a question I get asked really, really, really often. And that's because honestly, you can't start with fresh bones because it kind of has this greasy metallic taste. Even if you skim the fat, it's very, very different. And that's because bones have a lot of connective tissue and things like that that we don't ordinarily eat. If you are cooking a roast or something, a lot of those things are trimmed off. You've already cooked it. You've sort of rendered a lot of that fat, and you've changed and caramelized the bones in such a way that they actually taste a lot better. So for people who are starting with bones from something they've cooked, that's way easier. And I talk about that a lot. But one of the things that people have to know is that this book explains what to do if you have, say, a large quantity of fresh bones. And it's a little bit more of a process, but this way people aren't going to make a whole pot of broth that they're never going to eat. But today I'm not actually going to be making beef broth. My family's had a cold lately, not anything more serious than a cold. I know because we've all taken tests, but because we've been going through a lot of broth, I've been going through lots and lots of bones. But so today I wanted to talk about a Lenten broth that we can make. So when I buy anything that's shellfish, so like these actually came from lobster claws. We don't get lobster claws very often. So when we got these, I made sure to save these for broth. I keep little Ziploc bags, dated, in my freezer of odds and ends bones from things that I've cooked. If they're raw bones, I always make sure to write that they're raw. But I have lots of little bags like this. And I put shrimp in them. I put lobster. I put anything that we have. Believe it or not, you can also use the shells of things like mussels. So if you buy frozen mussels ever for anything, Orthodox families use a lot of shellfish. And one of the great economies of this is that you can actually turn that into broth. What makes a bisque is actually that you start using these kinds of things in your broth. So I was going to talk about how to make that a little bit. So I've got other things going here. One of the nice things about seafood broth is it actually doesn't take very long. So if you're using shells like this, you can do shells on the stove in just 40 minutes. If you're using a crock pot, it's about 2 to 3 hours. If you're using it in a pressure cooker, it's actually 20 minutes for shells, and that's it. So I like dump things in here. One of the nice things is that you can just take all of your bags, you can just dump them in there. You don't have to keep them separate as long as they're shellfish. So a second thing that people don't understand is you don't actually have to add vegetal matter. I mean, you could, but by the time you cook vegetables in your pressure cooker, you've completely obliterated all of the nutritional benefit to them. A lot of vitamins and minerals are temperature sensitive. And so you could do it, but you end up kind of wasting it. So that's actually the distinction between broth and stock. Technically what people are making when they think they're making broth is they're actually making stock. Stock is made using shells or bones, and it doesn't include vegetable matter. And what it does is we actually cook these things down to get all the vitamins and minerals that are, well, more minerals that are located in the bones. Bones are a really great source of like calcium and phosphorus that sometimes are hard pressed to come by in fasting periods. There's amino acids in the bones themselves, which give you a little bit of a head start on your protein. I'm gonna ask you to go get a kiddo to get me a kettle of water. Can you do that? So that's actually stock. Anytime you start with bones or shells, it's actually stock. And I'm going to tell you, I just call it bone broth because it's a lot easier for people to know that. But vegetable matter is actually added to not bone broth, and it's made using meat. And we use vegetable matter in those kinds of things because they're cooked for a lot less time, and it actually adds more flavor. My husband has a funny way of, he calls meat broths, actually he calls it meat tea. And that's a pretty good analogy because we add the vegetable matter, we add the meat, we cook it for probably 20 to 40 minutes, depending. Chicken is usually about 20 minutes, beef is usually about 40 minutes, because if you cook it longer than that, the meat starts to fall apart. You basically break down the proteins in it so it gets stringy and the proteins relax and then they toughen up again. And so actually it's stringy, but still very, very tough and unpleasant. And the vegetable matter is there to give it more flavor. So when people make broth using meat, it's actually less nutritious, which is something that people might not realize. And actually I have an entire nutritional breakdown on the difference between meat-based broths and bone and shell-based broths in my book. So people are going to want to find out about that. So when we're making seafood broth, I'm going to use a crock pot or pressure cooker today. I have instructions in my book on how to do it on the stovetop or how to do it in a crock pot and the timing and everything on it. Here's the simple thing about broth. It's basically three things. It's bones or shells plus water and thyme. That's it. You don't need vegetables. You don't need fancy chopping. You don't need to do any of these other things that people tell you. They complicate it. They don't improve the flavor, and they're not actually making it more nutritious. You don't need vegetable matter in your bone broths. It's not going to make it more nutritious. It just makes it take longer. You also don't need to roast it unless you're starting with raw bones. If you're using things like shells from cooked shellfish that we've eaten, if you're using a rotisserie chicken, if you're using any bones from anything you've cooked, don't bother roasting it. Don't make your life more complicated. So in this case, I've got a bunch of shells in here. It's really, really, really easy. So you want to add no more than just at the top of the depth of your shells or bones with water. You want to have enough water that you kind of give a place for those minerals to move into, but not so much that you dilute it. So with this, I've got my pressure cooker all set up, got my right ring in it. And in 20 minutes, I'll have broth. That's all it takes to make big seafood broth. So it's really easy. So just keep Ziploc bags in your freezer, put all of your stuff in it, leave it in there. And when you've got enough to fill a pot, you can make broth. Okay, but that's not the only thing I was going to talk about today, because as much as I really think everybody needs to have more broth in their diet, and like I said in my book, I've got a whole nutritional breakdown explaining the difference between bone broth and meat broths and just how much more nutritious it is. I even compare it to like those common little green packets of broth you get in the hospital. So people are going to want to hold out for that. I have a second thing to talk about. So I know a number of people, every time I'm on Facebook, people ask for a tortilla recipe. And I give away my flour tortilla recipe all the time. But the thing about the flour tortilla recipe is that it's only good for people who can have gluten. So today, the recipe that I wanted to share with you is corn tortillas.
Excellent.
So I have masa here, and then I forgot to have my husband reach down my press, which I can show you in a second. But there's a couple of ways to get masa. You can get fresh masa if you live in a place with a high Hispanic population. So what makes masa different than cornmeal or other things like that is that the corn is pre-treated. So fresh corn is cornmeal once it's been dried and ground, and it's really high in fiber. It actually tends to be really low in mineral content because plants are really good at locking up all of those minerals and preventing us from getting to them. Masa actually starts with corn that's been nixtamalized. Thank you. So, what did you say, son? Oh yes, the word, well, we're not gonna worry about that. We're making tamales in a couple of weeks, and he's getting really excited because we always have them for Thanksgiving. But with masa, the fresh corn is then soaked in lime, and then it swells up and it kind of becomes a different food at that point. It frees a lot of it frees niacin basically, but it frees several essential minerals that we would not otherwise get. But one of the vitamins that it liberalizes is niacin. Now, then when it's dried, it preserves its improved mineral complex. If you grind it fresh, which works totally well, you can buy fresh masa in stores. Sometimes it's available in the freezer section. Sometimes I'll grind it for you fresh. If you live in a very, very high Hispanic population area, you can get it fresh. Otherwise, you can buy it dried, where it's been soaked in lime, and then it has been dehydrated and then ground again. And it works really, really well. It does retain its nutritional values super well. It's gluten-free and it's high in niacin. And it's, when you reconstitute it with water, it's going to be about like Play-Doh at the right texture, but it still works. So it works really well, whether or not you have access to fresh masa or dried. So I will be giving you the recipe for the dried masa. One of the reasons that people in the South really struggled on a high corn diet and people in Mesoamerica didn't is absolutely the nixtamalization process, because it liberated so much niacin. So if people are interested, it's worth look up pellagra. Pellagra was a nutritional deficit disease that was rampant in the southern states in America. And that's because corn is cheap. It's easy to grow. It's easy to kind of dry out and store. And it was the backbone of the southern diet. Think about hoe cakes and cornmeal and all those kinds of corn-based dishes. These were often used in prisons and orphanages and in poorhouses, because it was definitely a food for the poor. But the problem is that when they were cutting other more expensive fresh foods out of the diet, these people were developing pellagra. Pellagra is a niacin deficiency. And what happens is about 6 months into the diet, they begin to develop sores and aches and pains and fevers that are unresolvable by any other means other than niacin. And it's a fascinating disease that didn't even exist in Mexico, and it was because of the nixtamalization process. So we're really fortunate that, due to some inspiring work of a doctor who actually got prisoners to volunteer to get pellagra so that he could prove that it was right. So he could prove that the niacin deficiency could be introduced and resolved. He fed them on this diet for 6 months, brought a bunch of doctors in to confirm that it was pellagra, then instituted a better diet that included milk and eggs. And egg yolks are a really good source of niacin. Suddenly the pellagra disappeared. This plague disappeared. And at the time, people really thought that it was a communicable disease because everyone in the institution would get it. The problem is that no one else in the institution would get it. None of their care providers were getting it. So again, it's this ancient wisdom that was completely absent to the southern states in America. They didn't even know that the food that they were eating so heavily was making them sick. So I'll be talking a little about this. There actually will be a recipe for this in the cookbook, because there are so many people who are gluten-free and they eat really complicated food substitutions, which like I can understand. I mean, you want bread, I want bread, but often they're really difficult and labor intensive. So I'll be talking about this a little bit more. Today, we're going to be making tortillas. In my book, I'm going to have, actually, you know what? I will send you this recipe for this too. Arepas. Arepas are South American little cake made from masa like this. But the nice thing about it is they end up being a really fantastic substitute for English muffins. They're really satisfying in that they're grain-based. They're very healthful because they're made with masa, but they're really, really easy. It's literally just dried masa, water, and salt. So I'll send that out too, because yeah, it's really easy. So if you don't have a press, you can actually make really thick, what my grandparents would have called gorditas. And you can just press them out. You can press them with a plate. You can press them between your hands. But I'm going to be using my grandmother's tortilla press. So this press was my grandmother's. When she passed away, I got it. It was made in Mexico. I don't actually know how old it is. It's very old. I always joke that it looks like a Civil War relic. It's not beautiful, but that's okay. And it's in really rough shape. So actually I line it with either parchment or plastic so that nothing sticks to it. One of my kids dropped it. Gosh, it was probably like 5 years ago. And the original pin broke. And so they replaced it. And I don't even know what that is, but one of the kids found that and he put it in and bent it and it works. So I get to still use my grandmother's tortilla press. So when people see these sometimes in Mexican markets, if they're vacationing or they're shopping in a Hispanic district, they always tell me like, oh, is this how you make flour tortillas? No, because gluten springs back. If you've ever tried to put flour tortilla in one of these, you'll press it and then it'll shrink back up, because gluten's a very elastic protein. So it just shrinks back up. It's not going to do any good. But this is really good for corn tortillas. So the other thing that I'm going to be using to cook is actually, it's called a comal. I'm sure you can find them online. I don't know what they would call them. Sure. Yeah, it's just basically
like a cast iron skillet.
It's like a skillet, but there's almost no sides to it. It's got a 1/2-inch lip on it, and that's about it. Just enough to keep something from falling off. You can put a little bit of oil in this if you were going to, say, make a arepa, which is about a golf ball sized dough that's just pressed out. That's all you do with it. You don't roll them. You don't do anything with it. You just take your golf ball and press it. And then they're shallow fried. So it's deep enough to do that, because this is about, you want to go about 1/4 inch thick on that one. But in this case, I'm going to be making tortillas. So I'm going to move some things over here while we talk. So while I'm working on tortillas, I thought that we could talk a little bit about some other things that are in the book that are not monastic or, there we go, monastic or otherwise. It's not church-based, but instead it's the little bit more clinical side of my book. So one of the things that I realized that has to go into this book that we have to make sure that we cover is that there are people in our lives who have serious medical conditions and they're on specific diets, and we have no idea what that means. So I was thinking about this recently when a friend of mine, her husband developed kidney disease, and it was caused by cancer. But he had to change his diet in a way that was really confusing and complicated for them. And they weren't really quite sure how to deal with it. And it also meant that other people we knew in our community weren't really quite sure how to even bring them food anymore, because his diet was so difficult. And at a time in his life when he needed proper nutrition and care, happened at a time when his wife really, really needed help, and nobody we knew how to deal with it. And I had started looking this up because I thought, okay, what on earth could this man eat? Because the list of restrictive foods given to him by his doctor was so restrictive that I honestly didn't know what to feed him. And it's really interesting because before I started writing as much as I do now, I was a recipe developer. So just strictly recipes. So I would develop recipes that are like the hang tags on produce. You'll go to the store and you'll buy a bag of avocados, and you'll see, a recipe for, an avocado pudding, or you'll see a recipe for, a salsa of some kind using avocados. I developed those recipes, and it was a really fun gig, but I did that. My whole job was to be given a list of ingredients and find a way to make it work. And I still couldn't figure out what he could eat. And so there is a whole section of my book explaining exactly what it is these people can and can't eat, with advice and actual recipes. So the recipes in the book are not only informed by a historical perspective, but they're also labeled specifically so that people know, oh, I can feed this to somebody who's on a mechanically soft diet, and I know what a mechanically soft diet is. Or this is a food that I could feed somebody who is on a kidney diet, because I happen to know what that means. And when like I was saying earlier, that one of my goals was to make it practicable, that was the first thing that I wanted to make sure, is that people understood what these restrictions are. When a doctor tells you, oh, well, your kid can't have too much dairy because she just had her tonsils out, just soft foods. the recommendation that I actually got from the nurse, God bless her, really, really pleasant nurse, was just to get boxed broth and dissolve crackers in it. Just, I mean, one, that doesn't taste very good, but also that's not a lot of calories. And if that's all you're eating for a couple of days until, you know, you get enough healing that you can eat other things, you're not going to feel really great. And I wanted to make sure that people had an idea of like, okay, these are the restrictions, soft diet, or a GI soft diet. And now I know what that means. And now I know how to cook for that person. And now I know how to serve that person better than I did before. I think it's really, really important. Okay, so I'm like making my tortillas, mashing them down in here. They're very, very thin. The thinner they are, the better they'll go. That's why you need a press. But like I said, you can also make gorditas. My grandfather actually preferred gorditas. So my grandmother would take like, well, this is a little bit smaller than a golf ball, but about a golf ball size, and you press them flat. And it should, ideally, when you're done, cover the palm of your hand. I don't know that that's going to be a really helpful measurement because everybody's palms are a different size, but that was always my grandmother's instructions. Keep pressing until you can basically cover, that's like about a circle, the palm of your hand. These make really thick things. They're actually really good deep fried. So if anyone's feeling a little bit luxurious, they can also make some gorditas. I've got a pressure cooker going. It looks like it's not going to be too far off. And I will have some lovely seafood broth. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start putting these down on my skillet. So there's a gordita. I've got one that's just a corn tortilla from the pile.
Could you use a rolling pin if you had that on hand? Would that change the structure?
Well, so it's a lot like Play-Doh. So if you've ever played with Play-Doh with your kids, you can roll it a little bit, but really
Stuck.
Yeah. It would not really stick really, really well. So, I mean, you could, like, especially if you wanted to, but like I said, you can, I know people who use plates. You can use a cutting board on a clean surface of the counter. That works actually really well. You just kind of have to push down on it. Gorditas are always possible. You're just pressing it out to the diameter of your hand.
I mean, I think that would be a fun activity to do with my kids.
So all of my kids make tortillas. They all know how to make this style of tortilla. And I'm really grateful that I get to make them with my kids. Not in the book, but is something relevant to me. Some of my earliest memories of cooking with my grandmother involve making tortillas of different kinds in the kitchen. And my grandfather would always eat my tortillas first. And I'm going to be really honest with you. I was doing this like I think that I was probably about 4 years old. And I remember I dropped it on the carpet in her kitchen and I picked it up and it was not beautiful after that. It stuck to the carpet, but I thought, it's okay. And so I asked her to cook it for me because at 4 years old, I wasn't allowed to use the stove. So she had to be the one to cook it. And I am not even kidding. It had lint on it. It probably had dog hair in it. They had a Chihuahua. And I'll never forget, my grandfather actually, he buttered it and he ate it. And I remember thinking like, I wouldn't have eaten that. But at the same time, I remember feeling really, really proud. And it was the first time that someone had eaten something that I had made and told me about how good it was. And because I had that experience with my grandfather, I've always had my kids in the kitchen. And I know there's like any number of crazy internet videos where people complain about cooking with their kids. And it can definitely be a challenge and it can definitely take a lot longer, but it is really, really worth it. Not only does everybody need to learn how to cook because everybody needs food, but it can be a really important way that you can bond with your kids. Although I will be honest, it's not easy in the beginning. But corn tortillas are a great thing that little kids can even do. You don't have to have a press like I have. Although my kids, like, this is the coveted job. I think it's because there's a tool involved, but
oh, I'm sure. An accessory.
It's a lot of fun. But kids can do corn tortillas really easily. And the nice thing is that there are no expensive ingredients in it. We're not talking about things that, have like eggs or butter or anything like that. It's literally just masa, water, and salt. So if like you drop some on the floor or they lose some of it or the bowl gets knocked out, it's really cheap. So it's a great way to introduce kids to making stuff. I will send you the recipe for the arepas. And the arepas are really easy because the kids just kind of mold them. You just press them down into a circle. Usually with those kids, I will take like a small mouth jar lid and put it down. And I'll tell the kids just fill that with dough and then give it back to me. And then I can go ahead and shallow fry that. And like I said, right hot off the grill, they're amazing. They're so good, but it's a really great gluten-free bread substitute for people. They work a lot like English muffins. So you can even toast them a little bit later. They're a little bit more fragile, but they're easy. So people who are on gluten-free diets can eat them regularly because they're not expensive. They're not time consuming. They don't have a whole host of complicated ingredients in them. And they're actually very nutritious because of the nixtamalization of the masa. So I've got some tortillas over here cooking. I put them down before it was super hot. So they're maybe not as beautiful as I would have wanted. But the nice thing about tortillas is that if your water ratio is correct, they'll get a little bit puffy in the middle. But they don't have to. It's like pie. Even if they're not beautiful, they're still pie. They're still tortillas. It's still good, right?
Yeah.
Right. So it looks like I've got 12 minutes on my broth, which is pretty great. Oh, if we could go back to broth for a second while these things are cooking. The other thing that I do have in my book is I talk about making fish broths. Fish broths are actually a really amazing thing that you can have. There's a lot of nutritional value in them. There's more information on that in my book. But if you happen to live in a coastal area, a lot of times fishmongers will give you carcasses for free. So there was a brief period in my life in which I lived in Oregon, not too far from the Oregon coast, not on the Oregon coast, but not too far. And I used to get the carcasses for free, and I would make lots and lots of broth with it. So the main soup we had was bisque, because I would make it using the stock that I could make using free things that I required. A lot of people think, I believe that they think of broths made with shells and bones as being just an economy, just something that people used to do because it was a way to sort of wrest the last value out of anything that they were eating. But ultimately, even if it is an economical thing, it's actually more nutritious than using the meat alone. Like I was saying, my husband calls it meat tea, and he's not wrong. It's not much more nutritious than tea. That's why you have to add the vegetable matter. Not only does it give it a depth of flavor, but it gives you some mineral content. But that's okay. All right, so I'm going to be pulling a couple tortillas off in a second here. Super warm. But you can see that they're just starting to freckle a little bit, and that's what you want. You want them to be a little bit freckly, and they should be a little bit soft still. You should still be able to see a little bit of a bend in them. But this way, like I said, you can get your kids involved in the kitchen. You can get them cooking something. And like I said, a lot of people don't realize that there are some really delicious foods that just happen to be gluten-free that are available for people out there.
Sure.
Obviously not great for people who are allergic to corn, but hopefully that gives more people an opportunity to try something a little bit different.
Well, it's also dairy-free and egg-free.
It is, and it's perfectly Lenten.
Yeah.
And it's a good source of fiber for people who need fiber in their diets. It's not necessarily the best for people on some digestively soft diets, but it tastes good. I think a lot of times the gluten, like we have a parishioner who's gluten-free, and I always try to make sure that we have something that's gluten-free at meals for her. And I was buying those gluten-free English muffins in the freezer section of the store so that she would have those at different, and they're just terrible. So I started making arepas for her, which is I'll send you the recipe. And the nice thing about it is that they're quick and easy to make, so I can make a few so that she's got them, but they actually taste good.
Excellent.
So I'm not sure how much more I can answer for you.
Well, we've gone through kind of the different backgrounds for your book and kind of your motivation for hospitality. So I think, you know, once we get those recipes up on the site, then people will be able to make these wonderful dishes, either for those who are sick in their family or as a comforting food. I think what you just mentioned about the parishioner, that you make an extra effort to show them your love for them by what you cook and bring to coffee hour. I think that's really important too. I know we have at least 2 different families who have members that are gluten-free, and I know they're always very appreciative when someone thinks to provide them with something that they can also eat at group meals. And so I think these are some excellent recipes also going into the nativity fast. I know that I've never thought to keep my shrimp shells before. That just didn't occur to me. And so I think that that's an excellent advice. And I think my kids will also enjoy putting those in a bag, just kind of, and bringing those out of the freezer, like, oh, here are these shells. And now we're going to make soup. And so I'm excited definitely to try the seafood broth because I've never made seafood broth. I have failed at the beef broth, and for the reason that you mentioned, I did not roast the bones, and
It's not even just roasting. You have to, if you start with fresh bones, you have to boil them first.
So yeah, I didn't do any of that.
Right. So I talk about that.
It.
You should go look. Yeah, you can't, like, nobody wants it. Like, it's dog food at that point.
Yeah.
I fed it to dogs before. I know people actually, we have a parishioner, and his family raises and breeds and trains sled dogs for sled racing. And that's what they do with their beef. So they boil the bones so that you can, you know, you have to boil them. It's 20 minutes. You start with your bones actually in just dead cold water, the coldest water from the tap. Just cover your bones, and you have to slowly bring it to a boil. And once it's at a boil, you can lid it up and leave it for 20 minutes. And then you have to drain that off, and then you can roast them. It's a long process to start with fresh bones. Otherwise, it's just not tenable. But there's all this connective tissue that you will lose in that water because you just want the whole bones. And they use that water to mix with their dogs' meat rations. And dogs don't mind it. And it's a utility because they can save those things for the dogs. But like nobody wants that broth. Like, yeah. You know, like you were talking about, nobody wants it. It tastes awful. It really does. But if you do that, and then you can roast them and they taste better. So actually, if you look in the broth section, I talk about how it's just easier to use bones that you've already used for meals. And I think that people don't realize that it's actually more nutritionally complex than meat-based broths.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, because I think in my own mind, I would have thought, oh, you know, this meat is where all the nutrition is. So that's what I need to use with these vegetables. But I've definitely made some bad broths with the vegetables too, because I cooked them with the chicken too long. And then, you know, the vegetables were mush and they just didn't have any
flavor.
Yeah.
And
or
by then,
I've added too much salt. Like I've added salt, whereas, you know, it sounds like it's just water and bones. And so definitely added the salt. So I feel like this recipe is perfect for me because I've already tried and failed and been discouraged. But now what I'm hearing makes me think, okay, I can do that, and I can make these very nutritional supplements for our diet.
Yeah, you should try, just read through the broth section, because I think a lot of people don't realize they put a lot of extra stuff in it. Like, I think a lot of people think that they have to put vegetable matter in it because all the cookbooks tell you, but there's not a reason. Because like you were saying, if you cook the vegetables too long, they lose that brightness and they end up just kind of tasting grassy and overly vegetal. So it doesn't improve the flavor palette. And most of the mineral and vitamin content in vegetables are temperature sensitive. So things like vitamin A and vitamin E, although you get precursors to both A and E in vegetables. You get the compounds where your body can synthesize it, but not actually the thing. You get, you don't get beta, you get like, you get carotenes, but you don't get beta carotene. So at any rate, they add this stuff in and they don't realize that by boiling it, they've completely obliterated the vitamin A and E. It's gone because they're temperature sensitive. You might as well eat those things. Are you gonna have a tortilla? My husband wants a tortilla. it's yeah. I think a lot of people don't know that they make work harder for themselves, with the exception of fresh bones. Fresh bones are so much work that we raise our own beef, and so we do that. But I will do like 5 gallons at a time, because if I'm going to do it, I'm going to do 5 gallons at a time, because it's just too much work just to do a little bit. But in my book, I tell people, like, if you're sick, save the rotisserie chicken. Yeah. To save those bones. So I have I have all kinds of bone bags in my freezer all the time of shrimp or like whatever. My kids are used to collecting the bones. Although it is kind of weird for people when they come to dinner and I'm like, don't throw away your chicken bones. Don't throw that away.
No, that's excellent. Well, thank you for your demonstration today, and we will be looking forward to those recipes that we'll post with this video. So again, thank you, Melissa, for your time today in your kitchen.
I'll give you a picture. So that you'll have something for the corn tortillas and the arepas.
Yes, for the end product. That would be excellent. That way our viewers can see what
they look like.
Yes, what it looks like, and they can enjoy it at home.
Good. I will get those out to you like right away.
Okay. Well,
which means I have to fry one of these into an arepa. That's okay. All right. Well, I'm glad you're